home office you are in?
Yes, I am.
So I'm Andrew Smith. Some of my friends call me Sunfrog. That's my hippie name. And I've got a dear, dear new friend of mine, retired professor and fellow Presbyterian Belden Lane on the line. I'm an ex-Presbyterian, actually, and that's where I'm going to
Right.
begin my juicy question. But I'm very interested in the presence of God and the divine in the wilderness, not so much in our computers, which took us a little more than a couple minutes to figure out today. But I've invited Belden to have a brief conversation this afternoon with me as I sort of discern my theological path going forward. I'm a academically trained theologian from Vanderbilt Divinity School and an ex-Presbyterian USA pastor. And somehow in my studies, I stumbled across your book, Ravished by Beauty, which blew my mind because as an ex-Calvinist, I didn't understand how Calvin could be a tree hugger like me. But after reading your book, I started to be convinced it was possible. But then what really, really got to me last summer, as I was in deep deconstruction, I read Backpacking with the Saints. And now I'm well into, though I've not finished your recent book, The Great Conversation. But I'm into it so much that my wife and I went out and named a large tree in our neighborhood, Grandmother Tree. And on our daily walks in the neighborhood, when I can't get away from Cookeville and get out on the trail, I go and hug and talk to Grandmother Tree. And that's directly inspired by your book, where you tell us the story of Grandfather Tree, who's helped you through a whole bunch of stuff.
Yes.
So I am just enchanted and enthralled and energized by your writing. And I'm just so honored that you would give me a few minutes of your time this afternoon. And I'm going to give you a very juicy, very hard theological question, but I'm sure, given the kinds of things that you've written about, you're going to help me navigate this question, and then we'll spin it to wherever we can go. But my current spiritual practice, outside of attending a Unitarian Universalist church, which I've recently joined, is hiking. Hiking is my primary spiritual practice. And when I can't hike out in the woods, I hike in my neighborhood. And we do have trees where I live. So we do have a city park that has quite a bit of nature in it. So I can be, forest bathing, if you will, even in an urban setting. I'm in a micropolitan, we're a city of about 35,000, not quite St. Louis size. So I went from the PCUSA tradition, which I understand you're a little bit familiar with. You've included Presbyterian in your bio, and you've written about integrating your wilderness path with Calvinism, which still blows my mind that you did that. And there's a lot of doctrine there. And I left that tradition, have been deconstructing for about 2 years after losing my job as a preacher in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And my response was not in sync with my congregation's response, to put it mildly. So I am now in a Unitarian church, and I went from I would describe PCUSA as fairly steeped in doctrine. We wore our doctrine loosely, but we were very steeped in Christian doctrine. And I'm encountering, at least in my Unitarian Universalist congregation, and I don't know if the whole UUA is this way today or not. I'm still learning my way around their tradition. But there's a severe lack of doctrine. We have no doctrine. We have atheists, we have Buddhists, we have pagans, and we have a Jesus intoxicated hippie me who may or may not be a Christian, but loves Jesus. But I love all the hippie stuff that they're all into, but I can't seem to wrap my mind around a theological conversation with them. And when I read your books, you don't seem to be fazed by the insults that maybe would get thrown at you. I've just encountered Victoria Lours' work, and she has the Seminary of the Wild and the Wild Church Network. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work. And she, in an interview that I listened to recently, said, well, the first thing they do with people like us is they say, oh, you're an animist, or you're a pantheist. And of course, we say, no, I'm a panentheist, but they don't know what that means. And so that's the end of the conversation. And so, and I don't necessarily need to have beliefs, but I would like to kind of be able to tell people where I am theologically and religiously, especially because I'm a trained theologian, and I kind of like being able to describe, and I'm also an English professor is my day job. So I like to be able to describe to people, what I am without 8,000 hyphens and without only exclusively poetry. And since you don't seem to attack this question directly in your books, I wonder how you help other pastors that you've met and other church or ex-church people that you've met, how you help others deal with this. Well, is it theism or is it pantheism, or does that even matter? How do you unpack this problem of doctrine versus our experience of the divine? When I'm out there on the trail, I don't worry about whether or not the rock. I encountered this massive boulder today that was covered in moss, and I was completely enchanted by it. I didn't have any need for that rock and that little mushroom I almost tripped over on the trail. I didn't have any need for them to tell me their doctrine, but we're doctrine making critters, we humans. So help me with this question. And if this is all we do this afternoon, Belden, if you help me unpack this question of being trapped between these different traditions, love God, love Jesus, love Mother Nature. I don't see them necessarily even as separate things, but I'm trying to, as I tiptoe through middle age here, I'm trying to find my way, and maybe being lost is what I need to be. But I felt like you were a great conversation partner just in your books alone. So I'm going to shut up now and see if you can help guide me through some of these problems and desires that I'm expressing here.
Oh boy, you open up a huge can of worms. I guess I would, what comes to mind just off the cuff is that I might call myself a Trinitarian animist. You mentioned the book Ravished by Beauty. I had taught for 20 years, 25 years at a Jesuit Catholic university, and realized that I wasn't a Presbyterian anymore. I was much more Catholic in my sensitivities and the sense of a sacramental universe. And so I thought, well, let's go back to that Reformed tradition and see if there's anything there that I can still buy into. And so the Ravished by Beauty book grew out of that. And it allowed me to really reclaim, in a very different way from what I'd known in the past, what had been a Reformed Calvinist background for me personally. In Calvin's understanding of the Trinity, and he really ties into the earlier Greek understanding of the Trinity, that there is a love, a kind of dancing energy of delight with each other that springs back and forth between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, to use those terms for the persons. Those are arbitrary. The whole idea of Trinity is arbitrary. We can't know God in God's essence, but we try the best that we can with the words we can find that may fit. And so the early Greeks used the word perichoresis, literally meaning dancing about. And the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, there's an interpenetration, a delight, even though they're separate, a delight in ravishment in each other. And out of that delight and love, shared love and desire for more life, there is a impulse to create more things to love. And so God creates this amazing world that we find ourselves in, God wanting, pouring God's self into it so that it is, everything in the world is a continued partner in that shared love of the inner Trinity. It's different from God, and yet it is inseparable from God at the same time. Everything in Calvin's understanding and in much of the Christian tradition, creation is not an event that happened millions of years ago, 13 billion or whatever we counted, but is a continual process of God in every moment, bringing things to life, breathing into it, dancing with it. And so you have a world, a incredible creation that is animistic in the sense of filled with the Spirit, alive, uh, and invites us always to that community that burgeoned out of the Holy Trinity, and wants to see all of us as a single family, caring for a common home, as the Pope says, Pope Francis, in his Laudato Si encyclical. So that would be my first stab at it.
Well, if that's true, and I think it is, where does all this adversarial alienation come from that gets kind of, heaped on our tradition? And we can see it in the mass society's treatment of creation. I mean, in terms of the resource extraction and the sort of, belligerence with which we, drive cars, fly airplanes, pollute rivers, uh, strip mine the tops of mountains. I'm just scratching the surface here. And then this idea that spirituality is an evacuation plan and a fire insurance plan for the afterlife, or even just the hymns, this world is not my home, I'm just passing through. As I've been developing my my pantheist, animist, wilderness-based spirituality, one of the things that keeps coming to me when I'm in a contemplative space with nature is that I'm an earthling, that this is my home. And I do believe that I've evolved from these other animate beings, and I feel that it is I think it was Joanna Macy's term, the council of all beings. We're part of this. I think this dance is inclusive of other species, is where I'm going, and of all of the other, life forms. And so I guess I like how you did that, but if it is incarnational and it is sacramental and it is a dance, actually, you know what? Let me ask you this: what about that dance? Are you familiar with Rumi? Right? You've worked with Rumi, so you know that he was the first dervish. He was the first spinner, and the hip. Like I said, I'm a hippie. We spin at hippies who dance in the very kind of Grateful Dead style. We like to spin, and that's another form of ritual. But we aren't seeing, you mentioned working at SLU and being Presbyterian. My sister-in-law has a PhD from your fine institution, and she grew up evangelical, and she kind of fused feminist evangelical with Catholic things. But we don't see this in the worship. We don't see, kind of Rumi dervish. We don't see, when it's Trinity Sunday in a PCUSA church, they don't make us dance. Maybe in some of your urban, maybe there are some urban PCUSA very progressive places that do dance, but we're not living it out. So I guess here's the question then: Are you kind of retrofitting our tradition, and by that I mean the Christian tradition? Are you retrofitting it with some of these other ideas, or is this really our tradition? And if so, why aren't we seeing that as the, I mean, if we went into the streets of St. Louis or Cookeville today, we wouldn't, and we were just like, like one of these talk show hosts, and we just went up and asked some random person, they wouldn't the first thing they come about wouldn't be animist nature or dancing or any of these things to describe our tradition. So I have a friend who's an atheist. He calls it, what does he call it? Making a silk purse out of a sow's ear or something. Are you just kind of using your great literate writing style and your own personal wilderness experiences to just sort of, why don't we throw the baby out with the bathwater for these traditions that are so steeped in historical errors as well as great mystical? I know my Hildegard and my Saint Francis for sure. But anyway, I've asked you like three questions, or the same question three different ways.
Yeah. you mentioned Jesus, the importance of Jesus in your life still. And that remains a touchstone for me. His being a wanderer, his being a critic of the religious establishment, his seeking to establish a community rooted in compassion, especially for those on the boundaries. All of those things that characterize the original Christian vision uh, still continue to empower me. I have serious questions, as every good Christian would have to have, about the church and directions it's gone through the centuries. We've bought into lots of other ideologies along the way, even beginning very early on with a Platonic Gnostic escape from the world that ran away from the incarnational roots that uh, were important. I am preparing, I'm going to Germany in a couple of weeks for the World Council of Churches meetings. And I'm going to be involved in a creation and prayer group. And our focus will be on how we pray, not just for creation, but with creation. How you read in the Psalms and the prophets about a voice that comes from the earth, the trees clapping their hands with joy. My grandfather tree is a cottonwood, and cottonwood leaves flutter in the least little wind. The Lakota people say that they're praying when they do that. Uh, the Psalms speak also of the mountains breaking forth into song. There in Romans 8, you have the earth groaning in lament, awaiting its delivery from the bondage that it experiences. And so we'll be looking at how praise and lament both rise naturally out of the created world, and that our prayer as Christians is one that is borne along by the larger nonverbal prayer of the rest of creation. And I think those passages, you can't dismiss them as simply a naivete or something that's simply metaphor. The biblical writers come out of an agrarian context, deeply rooted in the land, deeply in love with the natural world and its cycles. And so they readily, continually see themselves as part of a larger family, larger community that's incredibly important. Well, I don't know if I want to say that. No, more important, certainly, than the Presbyterian Church or any single denomination or religious perspective, but certainly feeding and supporting the best in all of those traditions.
So you mentioned lament and praise, kind of right, in there, and I referenced Rumi learning to dance, but I didn't mention that he did it when he was heartbroken about the loss of his friend Shams. And
Yeah.
you mentioned praise and lament in such close proximity. One of the most incredible phrases in Ravished by Beauty that made me your super fan for life. I'm like, hopefully I'll get to meet you eventually, and I'll get you to sign all my books. That kind of super fan. But you had, and I never went and found it sourced anywhere else. I've got a Calvin book somewhere. I think it's a prop holding up a computer monitor over here. It's a brick over here in the infrastructure of this chaotic office. But there's this phrase that you said in the Ravished by Beauty, and you attributed it to Calvin, but I think you might have been paraphrasing it, and it stuck with me ever since. You said anxiety can be a form of praise. And you were talking about it in terms of how we can't control the stars, that Calvin thought maybe, were it not for God, the heavens would collapse, everything we'd be sucked back into the black hole, or get sucked back into the Big Bang, were it not for God. And I'm ADHD, and maybe you can already tell that from my energy on the call, but also anxiety, diagnosed with anxiety. And um, I found that to be incredibly comforting, that maybe this proximity of lament and praise is something that I'm really comfortable with. I love the blues, and people who like really dark country, I love gothic dark country music, and the blues, and so it's like I like sad movies. And I don't know, I feel like, on the one hand, I'm sure you're aware of what the far right is doing, but I think in some of progressive theology, I think we've lost our way too. I saw a meme by a progressive pastor that I follow on social media, and I heard you say you don't really do social media, so kudos to you. But it said something along the lines of, we have to get away from narratives of redemptive suffering, or something along those lines. And I feel like, in a way, and I think this is why I can't, even though I'm kind of on the fringes of religion right now, I can't kind of shake my religious sensibilities. I'm also a recovering alcoholic. I can't get away from, like, all the important moments in my life have always been, when I've walked through the fire. It's never been like, I don't have any transformative Netflix binges. Maybe I've had one or two if the movie was really good. Actually, I thought of one just now as I said that, but I think you get at what I'm saying. And so is this embodied spirituality that you're talking about when you're talking about your all of your adventures, going on these backcountry trips, and being cold and wet, and you're waxing quite eloquently in your books about your conversation partners, but you're always doing it when you're like, you're running, maybe, running into the limits of our physical endurance. And you're doing this, you're chronologically advanced, you know what I'm saying? So, like, you're not, you're not like 14 doing this as
Right,
a
right.
as an immersion experience into adulthood. So do you think that that this embodied incarnational thing is one that is comfortable with that proximity of pain and joy? I guess is where I'm going with that question.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned Rumi dancing out of grief in his love of Shams, the loss of his teacher, beloved teacher. You see the same thing as Zorba the Greek, Kazazaki's great novel, where Zorba dances for joy, and when his son dies, he dances in a frenzy just to let out the grief. And it's fascinating to me that the distance between our highest moments of joy in this life and the depths of loss, the distance between those can sometimes be very thin. I wrote an article years ago on the Jewish tradition of arguing with God, and that the rabbi who would rage at God, calling for God to be faithful, given the suffering of his people, that is inextricably connected to the praise and delight in God. You think of Hasidic Jews, again, dancing out of joy and out of grief. That's been my greatest teacher, and that has been grandfather, this cottonwood tree. We met 30 years ago when a thunderstorm and lightning strike had taken down one of the great trunks growing out of the two trunks growing out of the roots of this 100-foot tree. And my mother was dying of cancer with Alzheimer's at the time. And it was a sense of loss, a sense of mutual suffering that drew us together. And I think that's what invites us in this time of climate change and environmental crisis, that the earth is weeping, inviting us to weep with it. And the earth still dances every morning as the sun still rises. And we need to be energized by both dimensions of the spiritual life, that we find ourselves at an utter loss without words in sadness, and at other times we find ourselves in an utter loss without words for the deepest joy. They're one.
What kind of reactions are you getting from your work from like traditional church people? Are they seeing it as kind of co-signing or ratifying their desire to be wilderness mystics? Are they wanting it to be for like a social justice witness about climate change? Oh, I lost my guest. Oh my goodness. I don't know what just happened. Belden, you've gone. I hope he finds his way back. This might be the end of this conversation. I was having a conversation with author Belden Lane. He's written multiple amazing books. The most recent one is called The Great Conversation, and it is about his experience and his relationship with Grandfather Tree that we were just learning about. And before that, he had Backpacking with the Saints, and I discussed at some length in this book, in this conversation, his book Ravished by Beauty, which addressed the him kind of reclaiming Reformed theology in the Calvinist tradition by looking at some of the Reformed theologians and some of their relationships with the ecstatic and with nature and with God. And I lost you. I don't, this has been a really good conversation, Belden. I'm going to end. I'm still live streaming right now, and I'm talking to you on my phone on the live stream. I'm going to end the live stream, but let's hang on the line for just another minute. That was absolutely delightful. Technology, for people who love the earth so much, loving computers and smartphones is not the first thing that we do.